There's something almost no one talks about the man who condemned Jesus. Because his story didn't end in Jerusalem. It didn't end in power, and it didn't end in the glory of the Roman Empire. It ended in obscurity, exiled, humiliated, far from everything he once fought for, slowly fading away, as if the world itself had decided to forget him. And here's what makes it even more unsettling. That man had the truth right in front of him. He saw it, he heard it, and still, he let it slip away. So the question isn't just what happened to Pontius Pilate. The real question is, how did the man who had the power to decide Jesus' fate end up like that? Pontius Pilate was not a king, and he was not an emperor. He was a Roman official, a man who had climbed his way up through one of the most demanding power systems of the ancient world. His title, Prefect of Judea, a position that, on the surface, meant authority and control. But in reality, it was a burden. Because governing Judea meant living under constant pressure. One wrong move, and it could spark a revolt. And a revolt could cost you everything. Pilate knew that. He understood that he wasn't there to do what was right, but to keep order and make sure nothing got out of control. Because in Rome, failure was not forgiven. So he learned how to move carefully, to weigh every decision, to give in when necessary, to act not out of conviction, but out of convenience. Judea was not just any province. It was a place where peace was always temporary, a land where religion wasn't just a belief, it was identity, it was law, it was life. Different groups lived there, each with their own vision and their own way of resisting. The Pharisees, experts in the law, the Sadducees, closely aligned with Roman power, and the Zealots, radicals, determined to free their land at any cost. It was a fragile balance, too fragile. One wrong decision, and everything could explode. Pilate understood that from the very beginning, because even though his official residence was in Caesarea, a structured Roman city with ports, theaters, and all the order of the empire, Jerusalem was something else, unpredictable, intense, hard to control, and every time he entered that city, he knew he was stepping into dangerous ground. That's why more than once his decisions sparked conflict, like the time he allowed Roman soldiers to enter with imperial standards. For Rome, it was normal, but for the Jews, it was an offense, a violation of everything they considered sacred. The reaction was immediate, crowds protesting, demanding those images be removed. For days, the tension kept rising, until Pilate, seeing the risk of a massive revolt, finally gave in. Not because he agreed, not because he had changed his mind, but because of strategy, because he understood something very clearly. It's not always the one who is right who wins. It's the one who manages to stay in control. That was Pilate, a man who didn't act from deep conviction, but from calculation, from strategy, from survival. On the surface, Pilate had everything under control. He had authority, power, and an army at his command. But inside, he was living under pressure, because ruling in the name of Rome meant answering to a ruthless system, and above all, to an emperor who trusted no one. Tiberius, a suspicious, watchful man who did not hesitate to punish anyone he saw as a threat. For Pilate, failure was not an option. This wasn't just about losing his position. It was something far more serious. He could lose his status, his reputation, even his life. And that forced him to make decisions, not always based on what was right, but on what was safe. He was a calculating man. He watched, he evaluated, and he chose the path that allowed him to stay standing, even if that meant giving in, even if that meant looking the other way, even if that meant silencing what, deep down, he knew was true. Because there was something Pilate understood very well. In his world, justice was not always the priority. What mattered was balance, keeping the peace, avoiding unrest, making sure everything kept running without drawing attention from Rome. And if achieving that meant making difficult decisions, he did it. That was his pattern, and that pattern was about to be tested like never before, because a day would come when he wouldn't be facing a crowd or just another political conflict, but something far deeper, someone who didn't fit into his system, a man who did not defend himself, did not negotiate, and did not beg, a man who remained silent, and that silence would unsettle him more than any rebellion ever could, because for the first time, he wasn't standing before a political problem, he was standing before the truth. And this time, calculation wouldn't be enough. Doing what was convenient wouldn't be enough. And then the moment came. A man was brought before Pontius Pilate. He was not a common criminal. He was not just another agitator. There was something different about him. From the very first moment, Pilate noticed it. Because he had seen many men fight for their lives, he had heard pleas, negotiations, desperate cries. But this time, it was different. Jesus stood there in silence. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to escape. He was simply there. And that silence unsettled Pilate, because it broke everything he thought he understood. Even so, he decided to question him. He asked direct questions, looking for clear answers, trying to understand what was really going on. "Are you the king of the Jews?" But what he received was not a defense. It was an answer that stayed with him. Because Jesus didn't speak like someone cornered. He spoke like someone who knew exactly who he was. Pilate kept watching him, trying to figure him out, trying to fit him into his way of thinking. But he couldn't. Because deep down, he already knew. He found no guilt in him. He saw no real threat. And yet, outside, the pressure was building. Voices were rising. Accusations were repeating. The crowd demanded an answer. And right in the middle of it all, an unexpected message arrived. A message from his wife. A clear warning. Have nothing to do with that righteous man. Because she had a dream. And that dream had deeply troubled her. Pilate heard it. And for a moment, everything inside him seemed to stop. Because now, it wasn't just intuition. It was a direct warning. But even then, the pressure didn't ease. If anything, it grew stronger. The leaders kept insisting, the crowd kept shouting, and then came the words that changed everything. "You are no friend of Caesar." And in that moment, everything became clear. This was no longer just a trial. It was a political threat, an accusation that could reach Rome, could reach Tiberius. And Pilate knew exactly what that meant. He knew what was at stake. He knew what he could lose. And right there, in that exact moment, he stopped listening to his conscience and started listening to his fear. But even then, before making his decision, he asked one last question. A question that has echoed through history. What is truth? It wasn't a philosophical question. It was the reflection of his struggle. Because the truth was right in front of him. He could see it. He could feel it. But accepting it would cost him too much. So instead of holding on to it, Pilate did what he had always done. He evaluated, he calculated, and he chose what would allow him to survive. And then, Pilate made his decision, not because he believed it was right, but because he felt he had no other choice. The pressure was too much. The voices wouldn't stop. The accusations kept growing. The risk was real. And in that moment, he did something that would be remembered forever. He asked for water, and right there, in front of everyone, in front of the crowd, he stretched out his hands and began to wash them, as if that gesture could set him free, as if he could say, "This is not my responsibility, I have nothing to do with this." But the truth was something else. Because no matter how many times someone washes their hands, the decision has already been made, and Pilate knew it. He knew that man was innocent, but in that moment, he chose something else. He chose the easier path, the one that protected him, even if it meant condemning someone else. And so, he handed Jesus over to be crucified, not as an act of justice, but as a decision made under pressure. And in that moment, without even realizing it, he wasn't just sealing Jesus' fate, he was also sealing his own. Because there are decisions that don't disappear. Decisions that stay with you, that come back again and again, reminding you of what you did when you had the chance to do what was right. After that day, Pilate's life went on. The power was still in his hands, the authority still seemed intact, and on the outside, everything looked the same. But something had changed, because there are decisions that don't make noise in the moment, but quietly begin to shape a path toward downfall. And in Pilate's case, that path didn't take long to reveal itself. Years later, something happened, an event that most people don't even connect to his story. It didn't take place in Jerusalem. It had nothing to do with the trial of Jesus. It happened in Samaria. There, a group of people gathered on Mount Gerizim, convinced they would find sacred objects connected to Moses. It wasn't an armed rebellion, it wasn't a violent uprising, it was a movement driven by faith. But Pilate didn't see it that way. From his perspective, any crowd was a threat, any gathering could turn into a revolt, and without hesitation, he gave the order. Soldiers were sent, and what happened next was not control. It was a massacre. Men, women, people who posed no real danger were attacked. The response was completely disproportionate, and this time, the consequences couldn't be hidden. Because unlike other occasions, the Samaritans did not remain silent. They spoke out. They took the case to a higher authority, to the man above Pilate, Lucius Vitellius. And this time, there was no room to negotiate, no strategy that could save him. Vitellius made a direct decision to remove him from power, and he ordered him to return to Rome to give account. After years of authority, it all ended like this, not with honor, not with recognition, but with a fall, quiet, yet final. And the irony is this: it wasn't the trial of Jesus that caused his downfall. It was the way he made his decisions, removed from power, stripped of his position, and no longer protected by the authority he once had. Pontius Pilate began a journey, a long, uncertain journey toward Rome. Because there, he would have to answer for everything. He would have to explain his decisions, his mistakes, his excesses. But when he finally arrived, everything had changed. The Emperor Tiberius was dead, and in his place, a new ruler had risen, Caligula, an unpredictable man, unstable, impossible to anticipate. And in the middle of this new reality, Pilate no longer mattered. His case was simply forgotten, left unresolved, without defense, without a future. And from that moment on, the official record goes silent. There are no clear accounts, no definitive ending, only what came later through ancient traditions. Some of them claim that Pilate was sent into exile, far from Rome, to the region of Gaul, in territories that today would be part of France. Cities like Vienne have been mentioned as the place where he spent his final days, far from power, far from authority, far from everything that once defined him. Other traditions, even darker, say that he couldn't endure it, that the weight of his decisions, his fall, and the silence that followed eventually broke him. And in that state, he chose to take his own life, a dark ending, quiet, far removed from the man who once held control. But the story doesn't end there, because according to these accounts, when they tried to bury him, something strange happened. They say his body was thrown into a river, and the waters began to stir, storms rising, as if the place itself rejected his presence. So they removed him from there and took him somewhere else. But the same thing happened again and again, as if no place wanted to receive him, as if neither the earth nor the waters would give him rest. Finally, his body was taken to a remote place, far from everything, where silence eventually covered his story. We don't know for certain how much of this is true, but what is clear is the message that remains. And yet, centuries later, his name appeared again. Not in a palace, not on a monument, not in a place of honor, but in something much simpler, a stone. In the year 1961, in the ruins of Caesarea, the very place from which he governed Judea, a group of archaeologists discovered a block of limestone, an ancient piece, worn by time, reused as part of a structure, just a step. But as they looked closer, they found something, a name, carved there by hands that lived almost 2,000 years ago, Pontius Pilate, and beneath that name, his title, Prefect of Judea. The same man who once held power, who once had the authority to decide over another man's life, was reduced to a name done on a fragment of the past, walked over by generations, forgotten by the very system he once served. And the irony is impossible to ignore, because while his name was wearing away with time, the name of the man he condemned never stopped growing. It spread, it was proclaimed, it was remembered in every corner of the world. Jesus. And maybe that's the deepest part of this story. Because Pilate was not just a man from the past. He was someone who had to make a decision, an uncomfortable one. A decision where the truth was right in front of him, but fear weighed more. And that's not just his story. It's a question that still stands today. What do you do when the truth is right in front of you, but following it could cost you everything? What do you choose when doing what is right is not the easiest option? Because Pilate chose, and that choice didn't just mark a moment in history, it marked his life, his ending, and how he would be remembered. Now the question is, if you were in his place, what would you do? And maybe the most powerful part of this story is not what Pilate did. It's what he represents. Because it's easy to look at his life and think, I would never do that. But if we're honest, we've all been there. In that uncomfortable moment when you know what's right, but doing it comes at a cost. It costs your comfort. It costs what others might think. It costs what you could lose. And so, you start to justify. You look for a way out. You convince yourself that it's not that serious. You tell yourself that it's fine. I'll deal with it later. This isn't the right time. And without even realizing it, you begin to do the same thing Pilate did. Not because you want to do wrong, but because you don't want to face what's hard. Because the truth many times is not comfortable. It's not easy. It's not popular. But it's still the truth. And the problem is not failing to see it. The problem is seeing it and still choosing not to follow it. Pilate saw the truth. He had it right in front of him. He heard it. He recognized it. But in the moment that mattered most, he chose what protected him. And that decision marked him. Because there are decisions that seem small in the moment, but end up shaping the direction of an entire life. And maybe today, there's something in your life that you know isn't right. A decision you've been avoiding. A step you know you need to take, but you haven't taken it because of fear, because of pressure, because of what might happen. So the question is, are you going to keep putting it off? Are you going to keep choosing comfort? Or are you going to do what's right, even if it costs you? Because in the end, this isn't about Pilate. It's about you. About that moment when you have to decide who you're going to be. And if today something in you was stirred, don't ignore it, because clarity doesn't come every day. And when it does, it's not random. It's an opportunity to choose differently and begin to walk in what is true. And if you want to take that step today, make it visible, not for others but as a real commitment between you and God. Write this in the comments. Jesus, help me choose the truth. Do it with intention. And if this message spoke to your life, subscribe to the channel. Because here we don't just tell stories, we seek to understand them and live them out. And if you want to go deeper, you'll find more videos right here on the channel, where you'll discover details that can completely change the way you see everything. Because every story has something to say to you, and maybe the next one is exactly what you need to hear. And if you know someone who needs this message, share it. Because there are people who are right now in that exact moment where they have to decide. Until next time, may the peace and light of God be with you always.